where we are actually going to cover a very important article which has appeared today, and it can actually lead to a lot of statements creation in the prelims examination. The article basically talks about the PIL which was actually kind of filed in the Delhi High Court, that actually asks whether the law can require the viable frozen embryos to be destroyed rather than donated, even when actually the couples consent on both sides. Take it. So, to actually oppose what it describes as a kind of a blanket prohibition on altruistic, voluntary, consent-based donation to infertile couple, the plea challenges the provisions of Assisted Reproductive Technology or ART Act 2021, which, now listen to this very carefully, which permits the embryos to be created using the donor sperm and the donor eggs, but at the same point of time prohibit the donation of unused frozen embryos for reproductive use by another couple, right? So for example, in our country, there is a huge section of people who are actually facing the issue of fertility, right? So what they do, they actually goes to some kind of let's say for example hospitals where they actually avail such assisted reproductive technologies, right, where there is a kind of a donor sperm which is actually kind of fused with the oocyte or the eggs of the particular lady in kind of an artificial condition, right? And from there the word basically comes from called as like a glass, right? And that is why it is in vitro fertilization which takes place, right? So here the egg is fertilized by the sperm outside the body in a lab kind of a condition, and then this actually develops the zygote. The zygote then transitions into development of an embryo which consists of 46 chromosomes, 23 from women and 23 from men, and then this embryo is actually placed into the uterus of the mother. So these are basically the kind of the steps which actually takes place: the collection of egg from the ovaries, the sperm collection which takes place, then the transfer of this sperm into the ovaries, right, development of an embryo, and then transfer of this embryo and ultimately the pregnancy test which takes place 10 to 14 days later. So this is the in vitro fertilization technique which we are actually discussing under this Assisted Reproductive Technology Act of 2021. What are the provisions of the act? First and foremost, for the registration of the clinics. So all such clinics which are providing this facility of assisted reproductive technology, they shall compulsorily register with a national register of bank and clinics, which actually act as a kind of a central base for all the essential legal operation. Now there are certain specific conditions which has been laid down under the act for donors and the service eligibility. So any such sperm donor or wiki donor, that person can be in the age of 21 to 55 years. Any person who is basically donating the egg or oocytes, that person can be within the age of 23 to 55 years. Now keep this in mind that any such female donor, listen to this very carefully, must be ever married and shall be having at least one living child whose age shall be less than 3 years. Such donor who is actually donating the oocyte can actually donate only one in her entire life, but during that process a maximum amount of 7 eggs or 7 oocytes can be taken from her, right? So let's say for example there was a doctor, that person took 7 oocytes. One of such oocytes has been used by the doctor and 6 of them has been crypto-preserved or basically frozen for a long period of time. Keep this thing in your mind. Now let's say there was a child which is actually born through this process, right? What is the right of child? So the right of child is that that person will be legally recognized as the biological child of the commissioning parents, right? And the donors, they do not have any parental right over the child whatsoever, and that was basically the kind of the issue which was highlighted in this movie called as Mimi. So we have understood the provisions of the act. Now what is this issue which has arisen? The act basically says, the section 28 of the act, which basically governs the storage and the handling of the embryos. So there is a specific section, clause 2, section 28 clause 2, which says that embryos can be stored up to 10 years, right? So let's say for example there was a fusion of the sperm and the oocytes, and that basically led to kind of development of an embryo. Such embryo can actually be frozen for till what time? Till the age of 10 years. What if the parents, they actually gave birth to one baby but they did not return for any other baby? What can happen? So in the case of it is not being used, it can be either donated for the research or it shall be allowed to perish, right? But let's say for example a PIL is being filed that if there exists such a frozen embryo, right? There is me and my wife and we have basically kind of created that embryo. We are saying that yes, we have the consent. There is, let's say, a friend of ours and these friends basically want that frozen embryo which is in a very healthy kind of a quality. The law says that no, even if there exists consent from both the sides, from the donors and the acceptors, even then there exists a kind of a blanket ban on the altruistic consent based donation to infertile couple. So various specialists says that okay, at certain conditions you are actually allowing certain technologies but then you are restricting some others. Remember that infertility actually impacts 27 to 30 million people in our country and thus it is a very serious issue. However, in the act itself there exists certain exception. So for example, Art Act 2021, it do allow altruistic donation from sperms and eggs in two conditions. One, donor is actually assisting the in vitro fertilization process, or there is taking place a double donor IVF where the embryo is actually created from the donor sperm and the donor oocytes. In that case it is actually allowed, where it is actually then transferred to the commissioning couple. So in this case there is a kind of a complete artificial semination which is taking place entirely outside the body, where even the sperm has been taken, even let's say for example the eggs has been taken from two different donors. They have merged that and now that is being put into the commissioning couple's body. This is something, in this case you can actually use the frozen sperm or frozen eggs. But again, if I am saying that yes, I have, let's say for example we have such embryo which has developed, can we transfer this embryo? No. So basically remember, donation of crypto-preserved embryo is not allowed. But yes, indeed, if there is, let's say for example, donation of frozen sperm or frozen eggs, this is allowed. That is basically the catch. So in such case where such double donor IVF is taking place, where we are basically using a frozen sperm and frozen egg, keep this in mind, there will obviously be no genetic linkage to either of the parents for sure, the commissioning couple. Okay? So remember these distinctions, remember the provisions of this act. It was part of an explained article and we move forward to the next news.